I have a lot of questions about Genesis chapter 23, and I think you will too after this session. This chapter is all about the death of Abraham's wife, Sarah. And throughout this chapter, there's one question that's not being answered. Where is Isaac? See, in the previous chapter, we saw Isaac almost get sacrificed. And then we're told that Abraham returns to his men. Nothing about Isaac. There are some specific details that often get overlooked here in Genesis 23, but we will be sure to point them out along the way. Let's jump into Genesis chapter 23. We're in Genesis chapter 23 in this session. For some of you, this might be the first time you've studied the Bible in the kind of way that I'm about to lead you into, where we ask lots of questions and notice specific details. And if you have not watched the last video on Genesis 22, the almost sacrifice of Isaac and how Jesus is all over that passage, I highly recommend you go check that out. You don't have to in order to continue with us, but it will be helpful. So either way, we're going to continue in Genesis chapter 23, asking lots of questions. And if this is a new kind of format for you, Bible study-wise, hopefully by the end of this, you'll know how my mind works and why it is we ask certain questions and notice certain details. The chapter swings open with this being said. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Why does this chapter open with the life and the number of years of Sarah's existence on the earth? Why does it matter, as we're about to see in verse 2, that she dies? And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Later in Joshua's story of the conquest of the promised land of the Canaanites, we're going to see Hebron mentioned quite a bit as God gives that land to Israel. But for now, it seems kind of odd that the chapter just swings wide open by telling us how long Sarah lived and where she died. So a question we should ask is, why does it matter where she died and how many years she lived? If you remember, Sarah had Isaac at 90 years old. And so Isaac is 37 years old around this time. At this point, when Sarah dies, Abraham is 137. And then we're told where she dies in Hebron, right here. That is Kiriath Arba in Hebron. Most likely this is by the oaks of Mamre, as we've seen Abraham spend a lot of time there. We saw in the last chapter that Abraham went to live in Beersheba. And so I have a question about that. If he went back to Beersheba and then she ends up dying in Hebron, was Sarah back at Beersheba and then they eventually migrated back to Hebron together? Or are we to see this as Abraham going to live somewhere different? After the almost sacrifice of Isaac, he goes to Beersheba, and then Sarah is living in Hebron by the oaks of Mamre. Are we supposed to see that? And we've seen Hagar. If you remember, Hagar is the Egyptian slave of both Abraham and Sarah. Hagar was visited by the Lord in the wilderness of Beersheba, and we've seen Abraham make a covenant with Abimelech, king of Gerar, I think the Philistines, at Beersheba. So this place has significance. The fact that Abraham is going back there, we should ask, why does Abraham decide to go back there after he almost sacrificed Isaac? Why doesn't the narrative tell us he goes back to live in the place where apparently Sarah ends up dying? Just something to pay attention to is these different locations seemingly. And also, where did Abraham go into? Because it says Abraham went in, right, to mourn for Sarah. So we should be asking, where did Abraham go into? Is it he goes into the land where she was? Does he go into the tent to mourn for her in her specific tent? Is the mourning and weeping the same idea? Because it says he went to mourn and he went to weep. And are these essentially communicating the same idea or potentially something different? Is the mourning about something different than what the weeping is about, or is it just two ways of saying Abraham's really sad that he lost his wife? Abraham rose up from before his dead, and I really want us to pay attention to this phrase right here, his dead. What's interesting is that it doesn't say his wife, it doesn't say Sarah. It almost seems to be very impersonal, just Abraham's dead. And I think this at least notes that Sarah belongs to Abraham and his lineage and his family and his household as if to be part of his name and his heritage. And so Sarah will be one among many that are the dead of Abraham, those who kind of come under the umbrella of Abraham's name and lineage. And then Abraham says to the Hittites, after he rose up from before his dead, Sarah, he says to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. There's that phrase again, my dead, which seems very impersonal. So why do we see Abraham turning around and speaking to the Hittites out of all the people? Are they present for this kind of funeral, for the burial? Are they just around? Or does he go to them right after this? Are we to see Abraham kind of rising up from mourning and weeping and going to find the Hittites of that region to make this deal and strike this deal? Either way, he wants to bury his dead out of his sight, which is odd. Just an odd way of phrasing, I'd like to bury my wife who's now deceased. The Hittites answered Abraham, hear us, my lord, you are a prince of God. Now this is interesting. Hear us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us. Or you might say, just as a prince of God among us. It's likening Abraham to that kind of reputation and standing. Either way, Abraham has an outstanding reputation among the Hittites, apparently. He's respected, he's honored by them, and we should be asking why? How? The only other mention of the Hittites so far in Genesis is in Genesis chapter 15, when God says he will give Abraham's descendants the land of the Hittites, right? So that has not yet happened. That won't happen until the conquests of Joshua and that nation, the generation of Israelites that takes over, coming out of Egypt. They go into the promised land. We won't see that happen for a long time. So in the meantime, Abraham is living among the people who inhabit the land that his descendants will take. And he's a foreigner and a stranger among them, and yet he has this reputation in standing among them as someone who is considered to be a prince of God, whatever that means. There might be a footnote here that says, a mighty prince. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. What's interesting about this prince of God thing for a second, this is some pretty strong language to attribute Abraham some kind of favor of the divine, as if Abraham represents God among them, or is some kind of ambassador, or some kind of extension of God among them. Either way, Abraham is a stranger and foreigner, but at the same time, he's considered a prince among them. And we're going to see Joseph later on in Genesis have that same kind of dual standing, right? Where he's both a foreigner in Egypt, and yet he's second in command under Pharaoh over the entire region of Egypt. And so we at least know that Abraham has been recognized by the Hittites as having some favor from God, having God's hand on him. Whereas, with Pharaoh and Abimelech, they recognize the same thing with Abraham. And so maybe word has spread to the Hittites as well that this man Abraham has a reputation both in Egypt, both in Gerar. He's known as having God's favor on him. And are we supposed to see this as Abraham stepping out in faith, taking God at his word? When he asks to get a piece of land to bury his dead, is this Abraham taking the promise of God in Genesis 15 that eventually you're going to have this land, Abraham, your descendants will inhabit it, and Abraham believes that enough to begin burying his dead there? I think possibly. Either way, he says, none of us, the Hittites say, none of us all will withhold from you his tomb. Like essentially bury your dead wherever you'd like, which again, here's that phrase, which becomes pretty prominent here. Up to this point in Genesis, we don't see this phrase a lot. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land, right? They are those who inhabit the land currently, but centuries down the line, it'll be Israel that does. And he said to them, if you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, right, there's this consistent reference to Abraham's wife as his dead. Hear me and entreat for me Ephron the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It's at the end of his field. I'll give him the full price in your presence as property for a burying place. And again, this emphasis on Abraham burying his dead out of his sight, kind of odd, just a weird way to view burying family members that are now deceased compared to the way that we talk about them. But Abraham has a specific cave in mind. He has a very specific plot of land that he would like to bury his dead in. For why that cave, why that field, I'm not entirely sure. He's at least familiar with the territory enough to know where it is and who it belongs to, right? So he must have been some kind of prominent figure in that region or in that society, somehow, beyond just being recognized by Abimelech or by Pharaoh and entering into the war between kings and rescuing Lot, but also he's recognized as having God's hand on him, and knowing where the specific land is that he'd like to bury his dead. Abraham essentially gets around. Like, he knows this place, he knows the people. And we have to ask why he wants this specific cave. At least this is a faith-filled response to God's promise that Abraham's descendants would have the land, and Abraham's going to bury his dead there eventually. They'll be raised up, or whatever Abraham has in mind about the afterlife and the future for his lineage. Hey, if you don't know me, my name is Jason, and I have some free gifts for you on our website at abovereproachministry.com. Maybe you want to learn how to study the Bible. We have free Bible classes just for you. Are you maybe a newer believer? Go ahead and check out our Christianity 101 Foundations course. Maybe you hate videos. Well, we have a podcast, so you can listen to all of our messages on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Maybe you want to join or start a discussion group. Check out our map of all the current armed discussion groups all around the world. And do you maybe live near Greenville, South Carolina? If you do, you should check out our church. Visit movementchurchsc.com for more information. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can snag a copy of my book, Fruitful, or head over to the donate page and donate through debit or credit card, PayPal, Cash App, Venmo, Patreon, or even mail a check to P.O. Box 509, Inman, South Carolina. And if you want to make a ministry connection, feel free to reach out to me on our website. All right, I know that was a lot, but I'm done. So let's get back to the video. But the whole idea of the field and the fact that there's a cave there and the fact that this is something that Abraham's willing to pay money for to bury his dead, it just reminds me of the parable of Jesus. Jesus gives a parable about the treasure that's found in a field, buried in the ground. And so he goes and he buys that whole plot of land, presumably in the promised land of Canaan, as if we who are in Christ, those who used to be dead in sin, we are the treasure that Jesus is after and wanting to possess. So he gives his life as a ransom to purchase his people and make us alive to bring us to himself. And this process involved him being buried in a tomb no one had been laid in order to resurrect. And he pays for us with his life. There's a transaction, right? So this kind of idea of the dead being buried, there's a cave in a field and something that is valuable to another person that they pay for. It just is reminiscent of the parable of the treasure hidden in a field. I wonder if there's any correlation beyond just it reminding me of that. But he says, give me this property, right here in verse 9. Give me this cave. Up to this point, Abraham has not had to bury any family members in the promised land as a foreigner. This is the first time he's had to think about this kind of thing, at least so far in the narrative that we see. And then verse 10, Ephron was sitting among the Hittites. Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites and all who went in at the gate of his city. In other words, we're sitting with the elders and those who have prominent status, those who have authority, those who have a degree of leadership in this city. This is an official business transaction. And Ephron answers, no, my lord, referring to Abraham, hear me, I give you the field. I give you the cave. In the sight of the sons of my people, go bury your dead again. I can't help but notice how often this phrase is used. Just something to pay attention to when you read the Bible, repeating ideas or phrases. And so, verse 12, Abraham bowed down. Actually, about Ephron for a second, a question I have is, why does Ephron offer it freely without price? Like, what kind of reputation does Abraham have to have among them for Ephron to know, or be willing, rather, to give this land freely to Abraham? And is it even based on Abraham standing there? Or is it just out of Ephron's good heart? Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people, no, if you'll hear me, I'll give the price of the field. Accept it from me, that I may bury, once again, my dead there. Okay? So I wonder why Abraham doesn't take it freely. If Ephron is offering it for free, why didn't he just take it? Why does he want to pay for it so badly? What we saw in Genesis, when Abraham enters into the war among the kings, between kings, and rescues Lot, at the end of it, Abraham tells the king of Sodom, he'll tell him that he wouldn't take a sandal strap. He said, I promised God I wouldn't take a sandal strap from the spoils of war, so that no one could take God's glory by claiming to have made Abraham rich. So Abraham essentially goes, I'm not taking any of the spoil, give it to the boys. and I won't be, given anything from this victory. Like, go ahead and take it. And I wonder, is this kind of similar? This kind of idea where Abraham does not want anyone to be able to say, I made Abraham what he was. I gave it to him for free. I gave him the stuff. He wants to preserve the glory and the reputation of God, possibly. Ephron answered Abraham, my Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Go ahead, bury your dead. Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. Now, what you're about to see is just a few details that make you go, regarding where it is that Sarah ends up being buried. In this field of Ephron, who is a Hittite, in a cave. It's all very interesting. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, watch how we're told where it is in proximity to a specific location, right? So we're using one specific location we know of as a reference point for where Sarah's being buried. And this location is Mamre. The field of Ephron is to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field. Throughout its whole area, that was given to Abraham as a possession. Now, this is interesting to me. Question number one. Why are we told that this burial ground for the dead, this cave, is east of Mamre? Why is Mamre and his oaks the reference point for what's happening? And very often, actually, throughout the Abraham story, the later parts of the Abraham story, the oaks of Mamre are a continual reference point. And so far the story, if we think about Genesis and just the story of Abraham, his story has portrayed the oaks of Mamre as a kind of garden-like setting that reminds us of the Garden of Eden, as we've already discussed in previous videos. And when Adam and Eve are exiled to death because of their disobedience and rebellion, they're exiled outside of the garden and they're driven east, right? And then Cain is driven further east. And then humanity, as we see throughout the biblical story, continues in perpetual death, and they're driven further and further east of the place of life, which is the Garden of Eden. So the Garden of Eden being the reference point for how far humanity is going away from God, not just geographically and physically, but even spiritually in their way of life. So a question I have as we return to the text is, why are we told specifically, why do we care about the trees? Is there a reason this detail is added? Might it also be an allusion to the Genesis 3 story, or the oaks of Mamre? Are we supposed to think trees, sacred place? Because as I've already explained in several videos up to this point, places like the oaks of Mamre, or high places with abundance and trees, lots of glorious trees, those were often considered to be sacred spaces where humanity interacts with the divine, or the divine meets humanity. Either way, are we to see possibly the death of Sarah just kind of reminding us that humanity is being driven further and further east of the ideal, which is the Garden of Eden presence and life of God. And the oaks of Mamre has served already in the story of Abraham as that kind of course, not Eden, but a version of it, a kind of temporary, lesser, not ideal kind of Eden. But verse 18, to Abraham as a possession, it's given to him in the presence of the Hittites before all who went in the gate of his city. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre. Again, that is Hebron, right? That is where Sarah was. That's where Sarah died, is in Hebron, which makes the most sense that she was in Mamre, she was at the oaks of Mamre, though the text doesn't explicitly say that, in the land of Canaan. She ends up being buried. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. Now, in the next chapter, we're going to see Isaac, and he gets a wife, and that's great. But a question we need to answer, or rather, we need to think about, is where is Isaac in all of this? And I'll come back to this in a second, but we are told this once again. After this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field in the cave. It's told to us twice in verse 19 and 20, as if we didn't already know that, right? So this must be a big deal that Abraham's first official plot of promised land is in the Hittite region. He paid for it. It's a cave in a field and all the trees. And there's an emphasis on Abraham's dead all throughout the chapter. But in verse 19, the chapter closes by referring to Sarah as Abraham's wife. Sarah, his wife. Probably because this individual, Sarah, is the focus here, whereas when we see Abraham's dead, that's just all of Abraham's family members that fit into that category. And the place of the dead for Abraham's family is in the Hittite land. We have to figure out, or rather think through as we read the rest of the Old Testament, what is the significance of the Hittites region? What is the significance of the Hittites in relationship with the nation of Israel? And why is it that specifically the place where Abraham, this is a very big decision for Abraham to make. I'm going to bury all of my dead. Those who continue down the line to my descendants, they'll be buried here in this cave, in this field, in this region. Right? And what's the significance behind that? Either way, we see another image of Abraham having a kind of peace or good relationship with the pagan nations of the land. Even though God intends to eventually clear them out in several centuries down the line, for now, we see Abraham quite a few times have a good relationship with the surrounding pagan nations and peoples. So back to the final question. Considering where Sarah's buried and what's happening in the setting and what came before this, right after Isaac is almost sacrificed, boom, Sarah dies. What a leap. What a transition. The question we have to be thinking about and asking is, where's Isaac in all of this? He was not mentioned at the end of Genesis 22. All we're told, and I can show you just to be clear, is at the end of Genesis 22, right after that whole thing on Mount Moriah, it says, Abraham returned to his young men. There's no mention of Isaac. And Isaac won't be mentioned until the next chapter, in chapter 24, when a wife is brought to him. And we find him in the Negeb at the well that Hagar fled to the first time when God found her. In other words, Isaac does not seem to be in the same place as his father is after Genesis 22. But we'll explore that further in the next video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video on Genesis chapter 24. Hey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more biblical content just like this. We have hundreds of videos, but you might be most interested in these ones right here. Also, visit our website for all of our free resources and classes. And thank you so much for partnering with us financially to make this ministry even possible. Keep moving towards Jesus, and I'll see you in the next video.